Okay, welcome everybody to the Indiana Library Federation updating your criminal history check policy under Senate Enrolled Act 410, which was our Library Matters bill of 2020, which it seems like was about 1,000 years ago, but really wasn't that long ago. There is some history to this. The reason that this went into the law that we put forward this year. And so there was a push back in 2019. Just the environment was kind of weird, and there was a lot of concern about criminal history background checks, not only in libraries, but how they worked in schools. There are lots of requirements in code for different kinds of businesses. And in 2019, there was a push for libraries to be required to have like this really kind of heavy-handed approach to background checks. And so the ILF leadership and our advocates and the leadership, the legislative committee worked really hard to work on that in 2019. And eventually it kind of died, which was good. But we were committed to bringing something back that would work for libraries as a good faith effort to thank all the legislators who were working with us that year. And so what we did was we identified the issues that were there and got that modified. And then as we were looking for developing our 2020 bill, we were looking for wins, right? We were looking for things that that our lawmakers would appreciate, that they would be able to get behind. And so we developed the language in this bill around something that libraries could really live with. So in Senate Bill 410, it passed kind of as written unanimously at every level, which is a huge win for us, and really built a lot of goodwill among the legislators for us. As you can see, it was unanimous at every level and was signed into law on March 18th. It's now Public Law 88, and it does become effective July 1, like everything else. But the law does give us until the end of this year to pass a policy, because it's a very simple law. So let's see. I'm sorry, I'm looking at my notes. I apologize. The key provisions, basically there's a lot of stuff around, but what we're focusing right now is the requiring a criminal history check policy, and also it adds libraries as a list of entities allowed to use the Indiana State Police, which is great for us as far as making it easy and aligning us with other organizations and other types of entities that have to do background checks. So what we're going to move on to now is a little bit of more detailed information on the kinds of background checks and what they offer. Over to you, Lucinda.
Great. So just as a reminder, there is a difference between a criminal history check and a criminal background check. So most employers run various types of background checks to verify that an employee has the kind of employment history that they say that they do, that they have the education requirements. There might be a reference check. You might do a drug screening. There are all kinds of different checks that an employer will do upon hire or periodically with a person. So we just want to be clear that while you may do more as a part of your background check, what we're focusing on is just the criminal history check for this particular session. We did go through this process. We really learned a lot about the definitions and the different types of checks that are run. So a limited criminal history check is just a name and background check, or a name and birth date check, where an expanded criminal history check also does a search into other types of databases, like a credit report or multi-state reporting agencies. And then the expanded child protection index check was added for the Department of Education. So it's important to know the different types of checks and those definitions, because they actually align with parts of the Indiana code. So we met in 2019 as we were going through that first bill. We actually met with the Indiana State Police. We met with Indiana Department of Education. We talked with other entities that had gone through sort of a criminal history check evolution of their policies to really understand what might be different. So I want you to be clear that the state police are very clear about the difference between a criminal history check and a background check, because a background check does more than just looking at whether or not the person has a criminal history event on their record. And there are different types of criminal history checks, even in terms of what types of databases, how far they expand, and whether or not fingerprints are required. That fingerprint report is the most expensive. So the key ideas from the Department of Education, I think, were really useful to us in terms of thinking about how we might design a policy and what worked for them. Because the law, as you might recall, several years ago, there were a couple high-profile cases, and the legislature expanded the requirements under for teachers and everybody who works in a school, including the janitors and the food service workers, the bus drivers. So what I think is important for us to remember from what the Indiana Department of Education told us is that, one, we don't want to automatically disqualify people from employment if they have a criminal history. What they shared with us is that lots of educators actually have something on their background. Maybe it was a minor drug possession in college, or maybe they had addiction issues way in the past. There might have been some event in their past, and it's really critical to use judgment. So that's one of the learnings that we learned from Department of Education. The other is about the timing of when the criminal history check should be required. And DOE is actually within, you can see that it's not before hire, because some of those checks don't come back immediately. And they have an urgent need sometimes, especially if they're looking at subs or sub bus drivers or sub food service workers. And so you might want to think about your timing very carefully as a learning from DOE. So we're going to talk a little bit about the requirements and how you actually develop your policy and procedures. Again, the requirement under the law is only that you have a policy. You have to adopt the policy by December 31st of this year that about how your library conducts criminal history checks for individuals who are over 18, because we learned that you cannot conduct one over for a minor, who apply to work or volunteer and are already employed. So it does not mean that you have to run a check on everyone. You could still say that your library runs checks on those who touch money or have contact with kids. That could be your policy. We know from the survey, and those of you who registered for this particular event, that about a third of the libraries already run some sort of check on all staff. About a third of the libraries run some sort of check on all staff and certain volunteers. And those certain volunteers typically are the volunteers who work with children, or sometimes who work with money, like your treasurer or your friends who work with money. About a fourth of the libraries have no current policy at all. So for you, the key is to adopt a policy by the end of the year. And then about 11% of you have that policy that already says we only run the check on those who touch money or who have contact with kids. So that's sort of the makeup right now. So most libraries already have a policy and already comply with the law. The issue is you simply need to have a policy. And we can talk more about that in the discussion if you have questions. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Greg, and we're lucky to have Greg Maduros here from Lake County Public Library, because he actually is an HR expert and is very involved in SHRM, which is the Society of Human Resources Management. So I'll turn it over to Greg, and I may pop in and just clarify some things because Greg's really a great expert in the HR area.
Thanks, Lucinda. And yes, please jump in. and I'll be looking at my notes too. So developing your policy and procedures, the law requires that you have a criminal history check policy, but in the policy, the big debate or the big discussion is who's subject to the check, which Lucinda's talked about. When, as we talked about a few minutes ago, when does a check occur? And that's a big thing right now. At the Lake County Public Library, we do it right after they're hired, all staff and volunteers now. For the who. Included in the procedures is a different who runs the check. Right now, I'm just in charge of running the checks, and they're in a locked cabinet, all that information in my office. What types of offenses might disqualify one from employment or volunteering for what types of positions. I know last year at the National SHRM Conference, the Society of Human Resource Management, they did a big push. I don't know if any of you guys went to it, but they did a big push on second chances, giving people second chances that might have a record. So a big thing is what position they're applying for and what information that comes back. How is that going to relate to the job that they're doing? When do you rerun checks? That's a big thing we're still debating here at Lake County. We don't know how to handle that. So I'm looking to get some information about that as well. And then what service do you use to conduct the check, our criminal history check, and how do you pay for it? We do, our payroll service has a whole background check and criminal history as part of that too. Other considerations in the new policies, consider how you will implement for existing staff. That's a big thing that we're trying to do. Is it going to be on a cycle? How many years? What position? How are you going to phase it in? We don't know here how we're going to do that. So that's some information I'm looking to get. Inability to share criminal history check information. Many library staff already completed the checks through school. Entities are not permitted to share criminal history checks with each other. I know, for example, last year we hired a couple clerks, and I don't know if they worked for the schools before, but they said they already had a criminal history check done, but we decided still to run our own because how all that is going to play out. Minors, we don't run them for here at Lake County under 18. But what happens when they do turn 18? We need to decide what we're going to do on that. And the directors, is there a different procedure on how, when you're looking for a director, how's that done? Right now in our policy, we do it, the personnel committee on our board, I'll run the background check on the director. I mean, we haven't had to do it since we put anything into place, but then I'll go back to the personnel committee for that. So process and who's going to authorize that, and where do you give that criminal history check information to? And then another big thing is the Fair Credit Reporting Act, because if some negative information does come back and you do not hire them for one of those reasons, they do have a right to dispute it. So you have those guidelines that you have to follow as well. So at the library, our policy or practice and procedure that we've had in place is for 5 years. And like I said, we're creating a policy here. I, as the HR director manager, run the criminal history check on all the new employees over 18 immediately after hire. If history is found, I sit with the director and we do a case-by-case basis. We look at the severity of the crime, how long, all that stuff like we talked about earlier, et cetera. Our payroll provider is ADP, and ADP has a service that we use, and it's a background information service. So like we were talking about earlier, it has a whole bunch of different other things you can check in besides just the criminal history. And it is an expanded criminal history. So there's different packages we can get, and the package that we get the last 3 counties they work throughout the country. So, and then we can do additional ones if they do come up, and anything else is a la carte. This is the draft that's up here that we put together. We put it together last year around this time. We really haven't added to it. We're just waiting. We didn't want it to be lengthy. We wanted it to be just to the point, not brief, but just the main points of like the policies and the practice that we're doing, and that it could be changed at any time. So this is not what we're going to the board with, but this is a start. And I got a lot of this information from the Society of Human Resource Management on their examples of background checks, criminal history checks. So I think I went over everything already when we just discussed the things. So, but yeah, I'm looking at other people's too and other libraries to get some ideas as well.
Great, thanks a lot, Greg. I'm sure we will have questions for you, especially as we navigate that sort of case-by-case basis of how you handle it. So we want to have 2 other libraries give you their examples. So I'm going to have Edra and then Fonda. So Edra, do you want to take it over?
Sure. So here at Hamilton East, we've had a background check requirement for employees prior to final hiring. So for over a decade, I talked with my business manager and said, when did we start that? And she was like, I don't know, right before you started. So we're pretty sure we've narrowed it down to around 2010 when we started working with Safe Hiring Solutions to do a routine expanded criminal history check. And you can see on the slide exactly what that entails. We pay $35, the library pays it. And what we do is we make our candidate selection, and then when we send the offer letter, it also includes the form for authorizing that criminal history background check. And then people do not get that final employment until they come back with that. And we have had some hits on it, but we don't automatically disqualify. But we feel like it's an easier conversation to have if that person has not started working. So that's how we've approached it. Our HR manager used to be our business manager because we didn't have an HR manager, but our HR manager handles all of that. He kind of handles all the communication with prospective employees, and we also do it on all volunteers. He handles all of that with the form, the communication with Safe Hiring Solutions, etc. I'm ready for the next slide. Okay. And you can see something completely different. Our policy basically just says what the law says, that we're basically, we already do this. We are wrapping a policy around our current practice. And so the simplest way for us to do that was simply to use the language from the code and say, criminal history background checks are required for all current prospective library staff and volunteers more than 18 years of age prior to performing any work or activity on behalf of the library. The way that we are approaching the background checks for existing staff is anyone who doesn't have one, we're going to go back and do one for those of our staff who've been here longer than we were doing these checks. So we're hoping to be able to get that phased in by the end of this year. So that we're actually fully compliant with our own policy by the time it is required. This is still a draft. We have not approved it yet because we want to get the specific process for getting those background checks done in place before we say, hey, this is our policy. I will say it's interesting sometimes when you have candidates who are from not Indiana or who've moved around a lot, sometimes this takes a while. So we have had some, I wouldn't say significant, but we've had some weeks-long delays in getting someone a start date because of this. But we feel like if we're going to do it, we're going to do it. And a lot of times it's due to having to talk to a county in Missouri or whatever. So it takes a little bit longer. We have for a long time, even though we don't have a separate policy, our staff handbook is a policy that is approved by our board. And we have had this language on this slide approved in that policy I think we revised this policy in, I want to say 2014, and this is the language that we use in there, and this is pretty accurate, really. We take it seriously, and we do follow these procedures. We have not had anybody who we have not been in the situation where we have discovered someone has falsified information at all. We have had a few people who've, kind of said, well, you're going to see something on my background check, and that's okay. We have not chosen to disqualify anybody based on the information we've gotten back. This is the last one. I've got one more. This is the last one. So as you can see, I've already said a lot of this, but we look at, when we have had hits come back, the HR manager and I talk about it, and what we're looking for mostly is we think about the job that person is going to be doing, and we're really looking for flags of, if they're going to be public facing and they have a history of anger management issues, that might not be a good fit. But what we haven't seen things that we felt would be germane to the work that people are doing. And we've also got a lot of things that are like college, and everybody's stupid in college. So, we cut people some slack based on what that is. Our HR does maintain background check information, and this is a little misleading. They're in secure files. They're not mixed in with the applicant files and the personnel files, but they're in the same secured location. So we have like a file cabinet with different things in it that is, it's a little like Fort Knox. It's locked in a file cabinet, which is locked in a closet, which is locked in an office. So that's how we secure those. So our approach has been to try to be very practical with it, and to try to make our policy wrap around our procedures, but to make sure that our procedures are clear and that we know how we approach things.
Great, thanks a lot, Edra. So Fonda, tell us about yours. I know you had lots of discussion with your legal counsel.
Yes, like most attorneys, he loves to discuss things. So can everyone hear me? All right. I always have to check my sound because it just, I don't know, my computer's always weird. So I had similar discussion. I went to HR and I said, how long have we done this? And I remember when I was first hired here, one of the requirements that I had to go through was a background check. So I've been here for almost 17 years. So I know for sure we've been doing this for a long time, dependent up on the position that the person held. So we had, director, managers, our accounting staff had to have the checks, and then we had our youth librarians only doing checks. So as we started to expand some of our services and our programs, particularly our volunteers, then we started to think about, like what impact that might have if there happened to be an incident with a volunteer who was working with youth in the library. So in 2014, our board adopted a policy that wasn't a background check policy per se. It was a volunteer policy, and it included a line that said we will do background checks on all adult volunteers. So one of the opportunities that we've had is to kind of use the 410 to bring some things together. We had like parts and pieces of things everywhere in regard to this, and so it's actually been helpful. So we're going from a one sentence which says that we will conduct background checks as required by insurance and allowed by law, and that was it. It's one sentence. So we're moving on to a policy that's more like 4 full pages, and we will continue to use validity screening solutions. Right now, it costs us about $17.50 per check, and it's a really nice service in that once we give them the information about the person, they handle everything else. We're not involved again until we get the report back, which is nice. And I will say we haven't had that many issues with like criminal offenses coming back, but what we have is people who have issues with their driving record, because we have a lot of vehicles in the organization. And so what we've had to deal with is suspended licenses. You know, people like they still have their physical license, but they're not actually allowed to drive anymore. So that has been the most common thing that we have found with our current procedures. So as we discussed 410 with the board, because I've tried to keep them well informed on what's going on legislatively over the last 2 years, and I think they have really appreciated it. Our attorney had issues about how we were going to manage the policy and how we're currently managing the policy, because what I run into a lot is that we have a policy that says we do background checks, but what we don't have is actually more of a procedure that outlines what steps we will take in regard to that. Because if you make a decision about one person, how do you defend that decision if you have to go to court? And, you know, attorneys are always connecting the dots down the road to someday they're in court having their moment and they're defending not HR, they're actually defending the Board of Trustees. And so that's important to my board and to the board's attorney, and it's important to me too. So what I really like about the new policy, because it is truly a mix of policy and procedure, it does define exactly what steps we will be taking and how we'll be taking them. It defines terms so that our staff who are unfamiliar with a lot of these terms will have a spot and they can go and see how we're defining that, which I think is a real plus in what we're developing. It also clearly outlines where HR and the director have decision making and when it does become a responsibility of the board to act. So I think those are some of the key things about what we're doing that I actually like. So if you have any questions, I know Lucinda has the full policy and I'm happy to share that or answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Fonda. I know that we'll be talking about yours because you cover a lot of the detail of the procedures. So we do want to talk a little bit about some of the best practice learnings that we've had already. And you heard some of those from the 3 libraries represented on this call or on this online session. So we will want to get into those conversations, but I really want you to think about what your next steps are. If you are a part of that 1/4 of the libraries that don't have a policy at all, your first objective is to start assessing what is the best option for your library and the best practice. Again, part of what we want to do is balance safety with safe hiring, or safety with the fair chance hiring practices. There is a lot of attention to second chances for people who have had especially drug offenses or minor offenses that don't impact the quality of their work going forward, looking at time and putting things into perspective. So you assess what are your options for a policy. Draft the policy. We're going to give you lots of examples and some practices as you think about who is best to have access to that information. Where is it kept in your library? All of those practices you need to think through, and think through some scenarios of what happens. For example, one of the scenarios that came up when we've talked about this before is what happens if you see something in the paper about one of your employees with a criminal history or a criminal record, and how does that trigger a new check or some sort of discussion? But remember that your board has to adopt that policy no later than 12/31. So with that, I want to call open the, let me come over here and bring you to the page. So if you're on our website, I had also listed in the chat, we do not have this navigable yet, but we have posted an entire page about the Senate Enrolled Act 410. So some of you joined us, many of you joined us in April for the session about the cash calculations, and we have some detail there, and we are providing extra assistance for our members. And then the criminal history check policies, you can see Hamilton East's very simple policy, right? We saw the draft policy for Lake County that Greg had, and that's in the slides. But what we wanted to show you is LaPorte's policy. So I'm going to have you, Fonda, if you don't mind, just walk through in just a minute, like hit some of the highlights and tell me when to scroll to the next page. So let me make this a little bit bigger, and then if Fonda can sort of walk through a little bit about the detail that you included here.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. So as you can see, this is much more substantial than the one sentence I talked about earlier. So right off the bat, we're providing some definitions, and we're also stating that this screening process does not replace the reference check process that a person might have to go through if they're applying for a position with the library. So we're still going to do that reference checking. And so as we talked through this with our attorney, we worked through the definitions so that it's clear, you know, like we're not going to do a background check on every applicant, because some organizations do. It's like one of the first things they do, and they use that as an initial screening process. Well, we don't want to do that. We want to make sure that this person is somebody we really want to have in the organization. So we have the list of definitions that defines what that is. It explains, you know, who is actually doing, it doesn't specify that we're using validity, but it does list our vendor. And we're saying that our vendor will be required to comply with the state and federal laws. So that is also helpful. That takes some of the burden off of us to have them do that instead of us doing that. Because it's my experience, and I do love my HR people, but they forget how they interpreted policy from situation to situation. And that is one of the real reasons why I like having a little more detail in this, is because it just is going to repeatedly give us the structure. And when they come back to my office to say, well, and I'll be like, well, did you refresh yourself on the policy? So I think the definitions are really, really helpful, and I appreciate those. And then we do have procedures, which is at the bottom, starts at the bottom of page 2. You know, it explains that consent is required from the candidate. It's not just something that we're going to do in secret. It's an open process. And so I think that's important for people to know. It explains what we're doing with former employees. It gives guidance to current employees, putting, responsibility on them for reporting any changes that may have happened in the interim time from one check to another. We have been sort of, I'll say, trusting in that, particularly with some of our staff that work with youth, because repeatedly, year after year, we have 5 school corporations that we partner with. And every year, our staff who visit schools end up having 5 different background checks, because the school corporations don't share between themselves the information about that. So we're like, oh, they're good. They're getting, but who knows what somebody might do on summer vacation. So if something happens, we can now say, the expectation is there that you will report to HR if something happens. Now, it does give some leeway to the director and HR to make decisions about the results of the background check. So I think that is also helpful. It also explains, that the board, because really the board ultimately approves personnel actions of the organization. So it defines that process. That's on page 4. And then the other thing that it does that I really like, it says that it will coordinate with the volunteer policy at the bottom. So it doesn't remove that, but it kind of like finally connects the two, because they are connected. Our volunteers are in some ways unpaid staff, and we have obligations and liabilities where their performance is concerned, just like we do with other folks in the organization. So, you know, a lot of this is standard language. If you look at the documents that you're provided by a vendor who's doing this check for you, you'll see some of it repeated, but our staff doesn't really have access to that. And so again, I just found it really helpful because the definitions are there, the structure is there. I can say, well, refresh yourself on the policy, HR. What did we do the last time? Other thing that this does that I think will be beneficial to us is, for the last 2 or 3 years, there have been lots of questions coming from our insurance agents about what we do. Because when I call them and say, well, we're adding another van, another cargo van to our fleet, or we're adding a new mobile library, or we're adding a classroom, and they get concerned not only for the driving record of that person, but they also get concerned when you say we're buying a vehicle in which a classroom full of children will be in an enclosed space with the students for a significant period of time. So they're looking at it all around, and calling on us to, you know, keep them up to date on what we're doing, because it does in the end affect your premium costs.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. And I'm really glad you brought up the insurance issue, because that was, for any of you who are considering just having a policy that says you don't check very many of your employees or volunteers, I would say that that is a concern. We have heard from a number of libraries that their insurance agents are saying you must have a policy, and it must address those who have contact with children, or even the public or money. So I just want to refer you, I saw that there were some questions in the chat about the fair chance hiring. So if you look at our policy brief, we did address it on page 2. This was a very important consideration for a number of legislators as well, that there is a second chance movement. The governor has issued an executive order around it. There has been years and years of legislation on how do we have former offenders re-enter and have gainful employment. So it's really important. And we do know that many libraries actually use community service volunteers. So that's one of those considerations. As you are writing your policy, you may say, we only run checks on those who touch money or have contact with the public. Your community service volunteers probably are doing yard maintenance or, you know, certain tasks that don't have community contact with the public. So you'll want to think about that. If that's part of your standard practice, we don't want you to stop that. That is a benefit to your community, that you are helping provide a gainful experience to former offenders. So please continue that. And you just want to write your policy that really reflects the needs of your community. Or if you haven't used community corrections volunteers before, and maybe you want to start in the future, you may want to think about that when you're writing your policy. So do try to balance the need for safety and in meeting your insurance and your attorney's needs with the need for fair chance hiring practices. So with that, thank you very much to our speakers. We're going to conclude the recorded part of the session